Warning, the stories in this video can be of a graphic nature and depict sensitive information of real people and real crimes. Viewer discretion advised. Hello everyone, good afternoon, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Sierra Douthit, and you're joining us for Spooky Sunday, where we talk about the creepy, the crazy, the missing, the murdered, and the supernatural, all while I do my makeup. So I'm glad to have everybody here today. I hope everybody is having a fantastic weekend so far. So today we're going to be continuing with our series of the most notorious killers from each state and going to be talking about California and Charles Manson and the Manson family. So if anybody knows me personally, you know that this is one of my favorite cases of all times. Charles Manson is one of the most notable cult leaders in society today, back in the day. So this is definitely a huge topic to be covering. But they did a lot of crazy stuff in the 60s around California and Los Angeles. If you don't know about them, not sure what to tell you, but I wore my Rob Zombie t-shirt with the X on his forehead because Rob Zombie did make a Helter Skelter song in regards to Charles Manson, and we're gonna try and do a 60s style today. We're just gonna go full force into the 60s and immerse ourselves into what it would have been like to be around Los Angeles at that time when Charles Manson was causing havoc. Go ahead and sit back, get settled in, because today we are gonna learn all about what Charles Manson and the Manson family did and make him known as the most famous cult leader of all time. So sorry that my face is breaking out because I did a Thursday video with Dollar General makeup and my face did not take to it very well. So we're trying to get this under control, but the content doesn't stop for nobody. So here we are. Charles Manson was a criminal back in Los Angeles, California. In mid-1967, he formed a cult which became known as the Manson family, which consisted of around 100 followers. During that time in the 1960s, the family went on to commit a series of 9 murders at 4 separate locations between July and August. Charlie was born on November 12th of 1932 to his mother, 16-year-old Catherine Maddox, in Cincinnati, Ohio. Now, Catherine was not the best mother to be born to. I mean, she's 16, so I'm not knocking any teen moms out there. I'm sure that other people are doing a great job, but Catherine was not. She was a local prostitute and she was an alcoholic. So not a good start. Now, what we do know of Manson's biological father, his name was Colonel Walker Henderson Scott, and he was never known by Manson. Manson's mother had married William Manson prior to him being born, so he never knew his biological father. But his biological father was a local con artist. That's what he was known for, so he got in trouble with the law a lot. He allowed Maddox, Charles's mom, to believe that he was an actual Army colonel. And that was not the case. Colonel was just his given name. So he was very manipulative. Let's just go ahead and say that. We can see where Charlie gets it. When Maddox told Colonel that she was pregnant, Colonel stated to her that he had been called away to Army business and disappeared. And several months later, she realized that he was not planning on returning because he was lying. So Maddox was left to her own devices, and that's when she ended up marrying William Manson. By the time that Charlie was born, Maddox was still doing her bullshit, right? So she was still getting drunk and going out and partying and doing whatever because she's 16. I mean, the amount of questionable things that I did at 16 would be appalling to you. Maddox would go on drinking sprees for several days at a time with her brother Luther. She would leave Charlie with multiple babysitters over several day spans. On August 1st of 1939, Maddox and Julia Vickers, Luther's girlfriend, had spent the evening drinking with Frank Martin, and they thought he was rich, so they decided to rob him. Being young and stupid and not a good criminal at all, they were pretty much immediately caught and arrested. Maddox was sentenced to 5 years in prison for the robbery of Frank Martin and was forced to leave Charlie at that time with his aunt and uncle in West Virginia. Now, I'm not sure where William is, William Manson. It never really talked about him. I imagine he's probably a criminal too. I can't say for sure or not, but I mean, so far it sounds like he's not really doing much in the picture. At some point in that time, Maddox and Manson do get divorced, so Charlie is just living with his aunt and uncle until his mom gets out of jail. So Manson was paroled in 1942, and Charlie described the moments that his mom got out of jail were the happiest times of his life. This kid, he loved his mother. There's no denying that. He loved her, and she was not great. So that always makes me just so sad for kids in shitty situations. Charlie got into a lot of trouble growing up. He was in and out of the court systems, and he had a lot of run-ins with the law just because of how he was raised. Said that some of his first crimes, one of them consisted of him setting his school on fire when he was 9 years old. He began to get in trouble, like I said, with the courts for truancy and petty theft. They would try to put him in foster care or foster homes, but they could not find one. I don't know. By the age of 13, he was placed in a boys' home. He begged and pleaded to be released and returned to his mother, but all of his requests were rejected. And he was soon living on the streets and getting into petty theft again after running away. He ended up fleeing home to his mother, where he had spent Christmas at his aunt and uncle's the year of 1947. Maddox later returned Charlie back to the boys' home. And within 10 months of being returned to the boys' home, he ran away to Indianapolis. In 1948, Charlie committed his first serious robbery, where he ended up robbing a grocery store. Instead of just taking the food that he went in there to steal, he did come across a box that had $100 in it, where he took the money and decided to go rent out an apartment. For a time, he did try to do right. He actually got a job as the messenger of Western Union, but later just supplemented his wages by going back to petty theft and ultimately quit that job. Charlie belonged to the streets. Caught for his robbery and crimes in 1949, a sympathetic judge actually sent him to Boys Town, which was technically a juvenile hall for young inmates, but it's not classified as that. It's just considered a school. So he sent Charlie there instead of actually sending him to juvie in Nebraska. After 4 days at Boys Town, him and another student, Blackie Nielsen, ended up breaking out of the school, stealing a car, obtaining a gun, robbing a grocery store and a casino, and then driving across state lines to Nielsen's uncle's house in Illinois. Now, if you don't know, stealing a car is a crime, but driving it across state lines is a federal crime. So Nielsen's uncle was an experienced thief, just like top dog in Illinois. And when the boys got to him, he decided to take them on as apprentices and show them his thievery ways. I didn't know thievery had an apprenticeship. Manson was ultimately arrested 2 days later after the night raid on a Peoria store and was sentenced to Indiana Boys School, a very tough reformatory school in Indiana. So the apprenticeship did not go well. At this reformatory school, Manson was raped and beaten repeatedly by other boys at the school with the encouragement of the staff. That stuff cannot be happening to children. That's how you cause killers. Okay? Y'all gotta get your shit together. He ran away from this school 18 times. I don't blame him. At the school, he did develop a technique he called the insane game, where he would basically just, if he was unable to get away from his attackers, he would just start screeching and going crazy and like flailing and screaming to try and warn his attackers that he was crazy, and they would back off, which my family has told me since the day I was very little. If you're ever in a situation where you think you're going to be in danger or in trouble, just act like a freaking psycho and it'll scare somebody, hopefully. He did finally manage to escape that house with 2 other boys in February of 1951. They attempted to drive to California from Illinois in stolen vehicles after they had escaped. And they were ultimately arrested in Utah for, again, taking a stolen vehicle over state lines, because you can't do that. And he was arrested and he was sent to DC's National Training School for Boys, where he was given an aptitude test finally by a psychiatrist, which showed that he was basically illiterate, but his IQ was 109 and the national average in the United States is 100. So he was very smart and he was deemed aggressively antisocial. On psychiatrist recommendations, he was sent to a minimum security prison, but he ended up being caught raping another boy at this minimum security prison at knife point and was later transferred to a federal reformatory in Virginia. There he committed 8 disciplinary actions, 3 including sexual acts on other inmates, and was moved to a maximum security reformatory in Ohio, where he remained until his 21st birthday in 1955 when he was released. So pretty much his entire life at this point, he's been in and out of jail or like schools for boys. So, like I said, he's following very much in his parents' footsteps. So be a good influence on your children, please. In January of 1955, Charlie did end up marrying a hospital waitress named Rosalie Jean Willis. 3 months later, him and a pregnant Rosalie decided to try and drive to California again, but also in another stolen vehicle. He was again arrested and sent to jail for driving a stolen vehicle over state lines. I mean, what's that saying? Like, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Arrest me 6 times for driving a stolen vehicle across state lines to try and make it to California. Okay. Now there seems to be an issue. While in prison, Rosalie did end up giving birth to their son, Charles Manson Jr., which I didn't know about. That's pretty cool. Do you think he changed his name? Would you change your name, or like would you just like roll with it? Like, yeah, whatever. Because like I would probably just roll with it. But that's me. Any reasonable person probably would be like, we're going to change it. Rosalie and Maddox did visit Charlie a lot in jail. But later on, throughout his jail sentence, Rosalie did stop showing up. His mother told him while on one of her visits that Rosalie was actually living with another man. And so that started the divorce process. And they were divorced by 1958. He was released and jailed all over again, in and out of jail, over the next several years until 1967. I never lived a life of serious crime. I say serious, but I imagine that not really having anything going for you and just like being in and out of prison your whole life can't be fun. A lot of people in the 60s and 70s were serial killers, let's be honest, because you could get away with it. But I just don't think that that's what I would want out of my life. So I wonder why he just didn't stick with Western Union. Come on, Charlie. Man, we were all rooting for you, but you failed us. His formation of the cult started roughly after his last release in 1967. Once discharged from prison, he did begin attracting a group of followers, mainly young women. Now, let's be honest here. I know he's a bad person, but in his youth, he was quite a good-looking man. He mostly lived after his release by begging, and soon became acquainted with a woman, Mary Brunner, who was a library assistant at the local college. Manson ended up moving in with her, and despite her reluctancy to have other women come move in with them, they ended up also moving in 18 other girls into Mary Brunner's residence. Before the end of summer 1967, he and about 8 or 9 of his religious followers piled into an old school bus they had decked out in a very 60s fashion, and they hit the road. They were doing drugs, and they were dropping LSD on the reg, and they were living their best 60s lives. They roamed as far as Washington State, back down through California to Mexico, back through the American Southwest, before returning to LA. Now we're going to talk about the heavy hitters here. So the main people in Manson's cult were his right-hand man, Charles Tex Watson, the boss, the big guy. If Charlie's not available, Tex is your dude. Robert Beausoleil, Mary Brunner, Susan Adkins, Linda Casbian, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten. He did end up establishing a base, luckily, for the family at Spawn Ranch, which was located in California's desert area, in August of 1968, which had been a television and movie set for old westerns. Owner George Spawn, who was very old and very blind, would allow the family to live on this ranch free of charge as long as the girls would perform sexual acts on him and be seeing eye guides for him. So that's what they did. So not only influenced by drugs, mass amounts of drugs and hallucinogenics, he also became obsessed with the Beatles. Naturally, in that time, everybody was obsessed with the Beatles. Most notably, their song Helter Skelter on their White Album from 1968. Although I don't believe that this is what the Beatles had intended for, Manson did interpret their song lyrics to Helter Skelter as an incitation to start a race war. He would turn to the album in total to justify and coerce his followers into murder, basically. So the family Manson has been said to have actually carried out a total of 35 crimes, but only 9 of them have been tried and convicted for due to lack of evidence. I mean, the 60s, it's the 60s, in the 70s. You can't find anything. Everybody was getting away with everything back in those days. By no fault to the American police system. Technology was just trash. Can't help it. So we're going to go ahead and give you this little tidbit of information. So on May 18th of 1969, Terry Melcher, a known recording artist, a known record manager person, showed up to Spawn Ranch to hear Charlie and the women sing, because Charlie was ultimately trying to become a singer and land a record deal. Weren't we all in California for that reason? Ultimately, after the visit, Terry Melcher decided not to record them or give them a deal which pissed Manson off. By June, he was telling the family that they might need to start a helter-skelter, so a race war. Let's get into the crimes. Manson had tasked Tex to obtain money for the family and the ranch to prepare for the conflict of the race war. Tex decided to defraud an African-American man named Bernard Lotzapapa. That's cute. Lotzapapa Crow. Crow responded to this stealing or defrauding as any big man who was in charge of shit would. He was like, I'm gonna come in and I'm gonna wipe out your entire family over at Spawn Ranch. And so little did everybody know that these tiny little hippie women could create such madness. The family counteracted and ended up shooting Crow in Manson's apartment in Hollywood to protect themselves. The second victim of the Manson family was Gary Hinman. He was a music teacher and a PhD student at UCLA at the time, and he had befriended some of the female members of the Manson family. Manson was under the impression that he was wealthy, and he had tasked the women to convince him to join the family and to come live on the ranch with them. When Hinman said no, the 3 members of the family held him hostage in his apartment for 2 days, during which time Manson showed up with a sword nonetheless and cut off his ear, or slashed his ear. After that, Bousselet then stabbed Hinman to death by Manson's instructions. Before leaving the crime scene, they drew political piggy on the wall in Hinman's blood and a panther paw, which was the symbol for the Black Panthers at the time. The most notable case for the family is, of course, the murder of Sharon Tate and friends. Manson entered the property at 150 Cielo Drive uninvited on March 23rd of 1969, which was being rented by Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski at the time. When Manson showed up, he thought that Terry Melcher was still living there, but Terry had rented it out to Tate and Polanski. While casing the property, he was met by Tate's friend at the time. I cannot pronounce the first name, so we're just going to go by his last name, Hatami, who was a photographer friend of Tate's. He had approached Manson after he had spotted him lurking through the windows, to which Manson had asked for somebody that Hatami's name he did not recognize, and then informed Manson that this was the Polanski residence. According to a family member at trial, after the first initial scout out of the property, Manson decided that he was going to continue with the targeting of the Polanski-Tate household because it still represented the showbiz world that had rejected him. On the night of August 8th, 1969, Manson directed 4 of his main family members, Charles Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Casbian, to go to Melcher's former home and kill everybody in the residence. At the time of the attack, as they were driving up to 150 Cielo Drive, a 16-year-old boy named Stephen Parent was visiting with his friend at the time and was getting ready to leave when they came across him and shot him dead simply because he was in the driveway. Now, Casbian was one of the younger members at this time. She was only 19, and she was horrified by the murder of Parent. So instead of going inside the house and actually committing the murders of Sharon Tate and friends, she decided to stay outside and be the getaway driver and the lookout in case anybody was coming. She would later become the star witness in most of the trials against the members of this family. The remaining 3 members ended up breaking into the home and herding Tate, Fryowski, Folgers, and Sebring, all the people that were in the residence at this time, into the living room where they tied them up. Sebring was one of Tate's very best friends, and he was actually shot and brutally kicked to death trying to defend a pregnant Tate at the time. During the murder spree, Fryowski and Folger actually managed to escape the house at the time. At trial, Caspian described how she saw Fryowski staggering out of the house covered in blood and was horrified at the sight. But despite Caspian pleading to the attacker, Fryowski was bludgeoned to death on the front lawn repeatedly. Folger escaped from the house with terrible injuries and was caught on the front lawn and stabbed 28 times. 28 times is excessive. As the 8-month pregnant Tate pleaded for the life of her child, she was mercilessly stabbed in the stomach by Adkins. Caspian told of Adkins' chilling words to Tate before she ultimately died. "Look, bitch, I have no mercy for you. You're going to die and you better get used to it." Adkins then used Tate's blood to write pig on the front door of the home. After the attacks, Manson criticized the murders as being very sloppy. So, Daddy was not pleased. Ew. That following night after the Tate murders, Manson took Krenwinkel and Van Houten to the LaBianca residence, and the couple was murdered in a similarly horrifying fashion. The Tate murders became national news on August 9th of 1969 after the housekeeper arrived and discovered the gruesome scene and all of the bodies of the victims. On August 12th of 1969, the LAPD held a press conference stating that the Tate and LaBianca murders had no connection at all. And by August 16th, 1969, Spahn Ranch was raided, but not for the murders. They were raided simply because the LAPD had thought that they were suspects in a major auto theft ring. And so Manson and 25 of the family members were arrested ultimately for that. But due to a misstated warrant, they were released a few days later. Finally, at the end of August, the LaBianca detective decided that due to the striking similarities of the words written on the LaBianca crime scene and at the Tate crime scene, that the two were probably connected. In 1969, also, some of the family members were taken into custody for other crime-related reasons, which had nothing to do with the heinous crimes that they committed. But due to Susan Atkins' confession led detectives to believe that Manson and his followers were involved in the murders. By December 1st of 1969, some of the family was arrested in the suspicion of the LaBianca murders, with Charlie and Atkins already in custody for other crimes. The most feasible motivator based on police testimony is that Manson's pathological ego, insanity, and belief in Armageddon were the influences that led him to leave behind a trail of destruction. Manson believed that he was the new Messiah and that after a nuclear attack, him and his followers would be saved by hiding in a secret world under the desert. Later, physical evidence of Krenwinkel and Tex's fingerprints were found at the Tate crime scene, which pointed to the Manson family involvements in the Tate murders. Amongst other physical evidence, such as the .22 caliber pistol and the knife that was used to stab Folger. The trial began on June 15th of 1970, with the prosecution's main witness being Caspian, who along with Manson, Adkins, Krenwinkel, and Tex being charged with 7 counts of murder and 1 of conspiracy. Sorry, I look crazy right now. I'm trying to get through the story, but I look like a crazy person. Lawyer Ronald Hughes was named the attorney for both Manson and Van Houten, but Hughes soon dropped Manson as a client because he believed that he could get Van Houten a plea deal or a lesser sentence by getting the jury to believe that she was unduly influenced by Manson's leadership. This move may have actually cost him his life, because later in the year he went on a camping trip and he ultimately disappeared. And his decomposed body turned up several months later, and it's said that the family ended up killing him in retaliation for not taking Charlie on as a client anymore. Van Houten, who was 19 at the time, did state that she did feel used by Charlie and that he took advantage of her vulnerability and her hate for her mother to basically coerce her into doing anything that he wanted. Susan Atkins was a crazy bitch, but she later stated in prison that she wanted to cut out Tate's baby. She just didn't have the time. And that there was a list of stars that Charlie wanted the family to go after, which included Elizabeth Taylor and her husband Richard Burton, Frank Sinatra, Steve McQueen, and Tom Jones. When asked why they wanted to kill celebrities at trial, Atkins replied that the Manson family wanted to commit murders that would shock the world and make people take notice. After Manson's lawyer released him at trial, he was then allowed to basically represent himself. He came out with an album that was titled Lie in an effort to raise money for his defense. How did this man get a whole ass record created in prison? On Friday, July 24th of 1970, Manson showed up to the courtroom with a tiny X carved into his forehead. He had issued a statement that stated he was inadequate to speak or defend himself, and he had X'd himself from the establishment world. Over the following weeks, though, the female defendants in trial ended up branding themselves with an X on their foreheads as well, or imitating. They didn't actually carve it into their face. They just wrote it on. Later, this X would become a swastika in jail and smack dab in the center of his forehead. So, on January 25th, 1971, Manson was convicted of first-degree murder for directing the deaths of Tate and LaBianca. He was sentenced to death, but was ultimately commuted almost immediately to a life sentence in prison after California State Supreme Court invalidated all death sentences before 1972. Caspian was later granted immunity in exchange for her testimony that detailed the nights of those crimes. So, in conclusion, Manson, Atkins, Tex, and Van Houten were all sentenced to death, but their death sentence was later overturned by the California state law, and it turned into a life sentence instead. Manson died on November 19th, 2017, of natural causes. He spent more than 40 years of his life in prison. Patricia Krenwinkel, now 71, was 19 at the time of her trial. She became California's longest female inmate and is now a model inmate involved in the rehabilitation program. Her parole was denied in 2017, and she will be eligible to apply again in 2022. Leslie Van Houten, now 69, was 19 at the time of her conviction. She had a total of 3 trials. In her first 2 trials, she was released on bail because of a hung jury, but ultimately sentenced again to death on her 3rd trial. She has had a disciplinary-free sentence since the beginning, and she's been denied parole 3 times so far. Charles Tex Watson, now 73, he was Manson's right-hand man, and he was sentenced to, again, death. While in prison, he was married, divorced, fathered 4 children, and became an ordained minister. He has been denied parole 17 times. Susan Atkins, now 61, was 21 at the time of her conviction, was called the scariest of the Manson girls. Now remember, Susan Atkins is the one that killed Sharon Tate. She was denied parole 13 times, and she ultimately died in prison in 2009 due to brain cancer that she had been diagnosed with in 2008. So that's karma. So there you have it. There is the backstory of Charles Manson and the main story around the Manson family and their killings. Like I said, there is a wide variety of things that you can dig into on the Manson family. It was a huge thing. It, like you said, is one of the most notable known cults, and he is one of the most notable cult leaders of all time. So if you have anything that you want to talk about, if you want to tell me about Charles Manson, if you got some inside knowledge, you want to talk about the case, go ahead and drop a comment below. I will be responding to all the comments. I will be leaving any makeup that I used in this video in the description below as well. I try to do a 60s look. They do a very like prominent curve around their eyes and just like one base color on their eyelids. And then of course the clockwork orange tiny lashes on the bottom, very Twiggy vibes. I was gonna go with like a hairdo, but that was just, it is so hot. I am like sweating my life away right now. But yeah, so that's the makeup that I did for today. It's very 60s inspired. And if you did like this video and you did like this story, go ahead and leave me a big thumbs up down below. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, ring that bell icon so you get notified every time I upload a video, which is every Sunday for Spooky Sunday. And sometimes Thursdays. I uploaded last Thursday where I did a full face of Dollar General's makeup brand, Believe Beauty. So go and check that out so you can see my honest review on the product. And don't forget to come back next Sunday when we continue with our series of the most notorious killers from each state. We will be talking about Colorado and the Bennett family murders. So this is a story I was not familiar with, and it is a harrowing, heartbreaking story. Just come check it out and hang out with me for 20 minutes next Sunday, and you can hear about Denver, Colorado's most notorious killer. As always, I hope everybody is staying safe and healthy as the quarantine starts to lift. Just be very respectful and mindful of those around you and yourself. Make sure that everybody is staying healthy, and I will see you guys next week. Let's have Rob Zombie take us out of here. Why don't we? Bye, guys.